Good afternoon. This is Rev Dr Cassandra Gould, and I'm so excited to be able to moderate this panel with these great Black church leaders, one in mid-Missouri, one in St. Louis, for the Jefferson City Juneteenth Festival 2021. As we think about Juneteenth, we know that liberation is one of the primary tenets of Black faith leaders and the Black church. It should be a primary tenet of all of faith traditions, but particularly in the Black church. Our very being in America was born out of liberation. Today, we're talking under the general theme of religious freedom, but putting a spin on it so that it is relevant for the time that we are living in. So welcome to this session, Who's Zooming Who? Using a title from our beloved now ancestor, Aretha Franklin, Who's Zooming Who? Over the last 16 months, we have been accustomed to using the word, the technology, Zoom. Many of us have found ourselves in Zoom rooms, some for the very first time and some more often than we would like. As we think about religious freedom, I believe that we have been hindered by a misinterpretation of the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state actually grew from a Baptist convention, if I remember correctly, in the state of Connecticut in the 1800s. It was put in place not by the government, but by the church to keep the government from always looking over the wall and interfering with what was going on in church spaces. Today, quite often, it becomes a default, it becomes an excuse for some faith leaders, for some faith communities not to get involved in what's going on, even when their neighborhoods and their communities are burning with inequities, burning with all of the problems, not just those caused by a pandemic, but those caused by the pandemic of white supremacy and racism, those caused in the Black community, especially by the pandemic of over-policing. And so today I have two brilliant friends and colleagues who are going to share with us who's zooming who around pandemics, policing, and politics. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves and give a little context on their own background and what they'll bring into this conversation. And then we'll go into some questions. And we'll start with my pastor, the Reverend Bridget Mitchell, the pastor of St. Matthew's AME Church in Boonville, Missouri. Welcome, Reverend Bridget. And if you can just share in your own words yourself, your information about yourself and why you're happy to be here today.
Oh, well, I thank you, my sister. Always, I am very grateful when I am invited to speak. I talk a lot. So I'm so grateful when people want to hear what I have to say. Well, as you know, I'm Reverend Bridget Mitchell. I am a mother of 2 adult daughters and a grandmother to 5 little gremlins. Well, one is a big gremlin. I have dubbed her Tween Me now. She's not mini me anymore. She's tween me. And so I love them fiercely. I hold a bachelor's in history through Ashford University. I have recently been inducted to Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. Yay, Sigmas, yes. I have been pastor here for 9 years in Boonville at St. Matthew's Chapel AME Church. Very grateful for this pastorate. It has grown me so much. And the ability to work in this community as a woman of color, as a woman preacher, despite everything that goes on around me and some of the comments that have been said to me. I still have a big mouth and I love activism. I love helping people. I love calling truth to power. And this right here is a great platform to not only kind of brag on my church that allows me to do some stuff. I said, I tell them all the time, I know y'all think y'all's pastors crazy, but there's a method to my madness, because I want them to understand that they are not locked down into what is the standard or the normal around here. So I'm pretty vocal, I'm pretty outspoken. I'm gonna say it. Most folks don't like it, some people do, but that's just me in a nutshell. I am grateful to be here, my sister, and grateful to be here with Reverend Gray as well. Facebook friends, and I'm just gonna enjoy this whole situation. And I hope from taking from this, as people watch this, is that the history with Juneteenth did not stop when Texas got that edict. It continues. And we should never, ever forget. We should never, ever forget. And so I'm grateful to be here and just to pass on some more knowledge to other people.
Thank you, my sister. And now I will have my brother and my friend, my protest partner, Reverend Daryl Gray, to come and introduce himself. He has so many titles, I don't want to mess up any of them. So I'm going to let him tell you the one that's most relevant to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gould. And I'm honored to have been asked to participate and to be in the presence of two brilliant, bold, beautiful African-American Greek sisters. It's an awesome opportunity and an awesome pleasure. First of all, to Dr. Bridget, before I do anything, Sigma Gamma Rho, God bless you. And the fact that I like that confidence, because Dr. Gould is Delta extraordinaire now. So and I am an Omega. It's behind me somewhere. So and I think that's important too. I think if W.E. Du Bois talked about Black college university students as the talented 10th, then obviously Greeks have to be that 1% of that talented 10th. And so it's no coincidence that all of us on here are from Greek letter organizations that promotes the service within us. I serve currently in, as Dr. Gould said, various positions. But in this one, I am one of the national commissioners for the Social Justice Commission for the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is the denominational covering of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I serve as the chairperson of the Social Justice Commission for the Missionary Baptist State Convention and the Progressive Baptist State Convention. I have the dubious honor of serving as a social justice chair for two very different Baptist conventions. And I serve as the political advisor for the Metropolitan Clergy Coalition, among many others, as Dr. Gould said. And I'm also one of the lead activists, organizers for an advocacy group called Expect Us here in St. Louis. So 40 years in the ministry, a little bit over 40 years working in civil rights with Southern Christian Leadership Conference, NAACP, Rainbow Push, when it was Push, and served in senior management positions with all of those organizations. Have been involved, and I guess on the front line, Dr. Gould, with you, dealing with issues of inequality, racism, police violence, and really advocating a lot more recently against voter suppression and trying to engage the church in social justice, or engage in some instances and re-engage in others. And as Dr. Gould said, trying to, as Reverend Dr. Bernice King so eloquently put, trying to make sure that our church, particularly the Black church, is real, relevant, and reachable. And so to be part of this discussion today on who's Zooming who, and of course, Aretha, you can't go wrong with Aretha. To have this discussion, I think is very timely and very relevant to the whole Juneteenth celebration, expression, and purpose. The whole, critical information, the fact that in Texas, the Juneteenth, that celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, probably the most important information that slaves received, I would say the most important information. And getting it months, oftentimes, Dr. Gould, we get the relevant information, the critical information, the vital information, oftentimes way too late. And so it is important to discuss the communication and the relevance of where we are right now, where the church stands, and the things that we have done right and the things that we have done wrong, and what perpetuates that, what moves that. So that's my good 3 minutes. I was timing myself. I think I did 3 minutes. But anyway, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you. And so right now, when I think about Juneteenth and what it means, one of the things that we have to think about is I'm reminded of Harriet Tubman's quote, and Reverend Gray just shared this and said this a couple of days ago when we were together. Harriet Tubman said, I would have freed 1,000 more if they had known, right, that they were enslaved. I think about where we are as a church collectively, what it means to be this alleged invisible institution of the Black church. I chose the title, Who's Zooming Who, because I believe oftentimes we believe that we are complying, whether it is with authorities or whether it is with tradition. We're complying with the most conservative people in our congregations and etc. when we silence ourselves. Who's Zooming who, right? Who actually wins when the church is silent? Juneteenth is a celebration, not actually of when technically on paper our enslaved ancestors were free, but when they found out they were free. I believe that if nothing else, after living through this last 16 months of the pandemic and still being in it, that we ought to come out of this with some sort of liberation. We ought to know that we are free in this moment to be able to help ourselves and to free our community. And so that is why we are here. Let's not forget that it was the same year, the very same year that our enslaved ancestors right here in the state of Missouri also got their freedom just a few months earlier than that. Technically the next to last state as well. So here we are. Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. The pandemic, again, which is ongoing. Don't let the CDC get you killed. Still wear your mask, still practice all of those things that you are practicing. In the pandemic, there were inequities that we knew. We are the people that bury those who die prematurely. We're the people that cry at the bedsides of people. We're those who provide benevolent offering to people who don't have Medicaid expansion, who don't have insurance of any kind. So we already knew what was obvious, but it was Black people who were dying more than others and other people of color. It was us who didn't have initially access to testing and etc. It's us who still have some ambivalence around vaccines, and rightfully so. All of the empirical evidence leads to that. And it's us who will help us to stay alive and to get through this pandemic. I'm going to start with my pastor, who I know even in recent weeks has had a vaccine clinic come to St. Matthew's Church. who was advocating for testing and etc. Can you talk about 3-4 minutes about why it was and is important for you and the Black church in general, why we should make sure that we can get these clinics in our community, why we should be the messengers that's getting information out? Can you start, Reverend Bridget, and share just a little bit about that with us?
Sure. I started that because I figured out that even in a town like Boonville, where there's no like for real major infrastructure such as bus lines and taxi cabs and things of that nature, that the inner part of of Boonville was really, really lacking. The only hospital that we had here closed down 2 years ago due to some misappropriation of funds, some lousy company that the city council approved to come in here. And literally, so the nearest hospital to people in Boonville is 20 miles away in Columbia, okay? That goes for anything, emergencies, whatever. And so when they were offering the vaccines and the testing, you had to go out to the Cooper County Health Department, which is on the outskirts of town. I walk, but I'm not gonna walk way out there. And so people without access to go had no way to go. So just so fortunate that I pushed 2 candidates to be on the city council, both of which are members of our church. And so I started calling and questioning them. And I said, okay, why are there's just one site for testing and vaccinations? And I wanted to know who to talk to. And so all my bugging and all of my ranting and all of my daily calling got me to the nurse, the RN that runs the Cooper County Health Clinic by the name of Melanie Hutton. And Melanie Hutton, I bugged her so much that she just finally said, we're giving out extra shots. Can you come? So I went and got my first dose. And while I was there, I talked to her. I said, how hard is it for St. Matthew's to be a vaccination site? And she said, I don't know. I would have to talk to the council and see if it's feasible. I said, make it feasible. I said, you have people in my immediate area. I said, I'm not just talking about my church. I'm talking about poor people who have no access to cars. There's no bus system here. There's nothing here for them to be able to access their way to the Cooper County Health Department. And so maybe a couple of weeks went by and she called me and she said, are you still willing? I said, give me a date. And she said, I need volunteers. I said, don't worry about that. I said, I will train our people. I said, what do I need to do? What do you need to have? Whatever you need to have, that's what you'll have. And so that's exactly what we did. After she gave me a date, I trained the people. They came in, we had 100 people signed up. Not just church folks, but everybody in the neighborhood that could walk, or this was, because we're right in the middle of town. So it's like easy to get to us. And so we had a very successful clinic. All 100 people showed up for that mini clinic, and all of them came back for their second appointment. And so my thought was equity. I want people to understand the difference between equality and equity. We should be able to have the same things that the rich folks on the outskirts of town can have just because they can get in their car. I have a car too, but I'm thinking about the people in the neighborhood, the community, not just the Black church, but those in the community who have no way to get. I had people in my congregation who were 80 and over that were on the first list, but couldn't get to where they needed to get to. See, that's not equality, that's not equity. And when you have no resources to get to where you need to get to, equality looks like, oh, I think people have seen that Facebook meme where the different boxes are different sizes and that everybody can look over. But equity says, I get to have the same thing and the same access that you have. Whether you're rich, whether you're white, whether whatever, I should be able to have the same access. So that was my concern about the community of Boonville, because I already know I live in a really deeply red county, and I know that both Black and white subscribe to these, theories about microchips and things of that nature. But I wanted to be able to open up our church to be that front runner to say, listen, everybody should have a chance. I don't care if you don't agree with it or whatever. You don't even have to come here. I just want those that want to be able to be vaccinated without any hindrances.
Thank you, Reverend Bridget. When I think about what you said, equity and etc., Reverend Gray, can you talk about why the Black church specifically? All the churches should be concerned about it, but we're talking about Juneteenth, right? Our liberation, when we found out we were free. Right. In this moment, why should we be concerned about even vaccines and testing and keeping ourselves safe in this moment? And what do you believe our role and responsibility is in that?
That's a great question, Dr. Gould, because I think that one of the challenges that we face, particularly as a Black church, is that we've stopped. A lot of churches have stopped asking themselves, what is my mission as a Black church? They've stopped asking. There's an old adage that says, when America catches a cold, Black America catches the flu. Well, in this particular case, America caught a cold and Black folks started dying. It went well beyond the flu. It went well beyond pneumonia. We started dying, and people were looking at this. And as you said, when we talk about who's Zoom and who, there were so many voices within the church. Some within the more evangelical, conservative, white churches. We're not going to do the vaccine. God will provide. We're going to pray our way out of this. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of our conservative Black churches began to say some of the same thing. God, we're going to pray, and God is going to bring us out of this. And somehow we seem to be afraid to say, wait a minute. For us to think that God will do everything for us and we don't have to do anything for ourselves, that is not faith. That's superstition. And so it created these barriers, these barriers and these corridors of problems that Black folk had to overcome, because Black folk were waiting on Black leadership basically to tell them what to do. And for the most part, they were, even in spite of everything, they were waiting on the Black church to tell them what to do. And so because you had so many different responses to this, coupled with the Tuskegee experiment, history, you had this fear, this automatic fear. So you've got this automatic fear, you've got this reluctancy within the Black community, but we saw that Black folk were disproportionately affected by this. And now we're trying to figure out why. Okay, we finally got to the point where we figured out the why. Underlying conditions, the reality of the Black community, the disparity in health services. So you've got us disproportionately affected with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, heart attacks, lead poisoning, asthma, you name it, we've got it because of environmental racism and other issues. And so we're disproportionately dying. And we're still waiting on the church to give us the information that we need so that we can make the right decision, because the church has always been that clearinghouse for information. It was the church, particularly in St. Louis, it was the church that first identified, Dr. Gould, that in the white community, there were testing centers. But in the Black community, there were not. We're disproportionately dying, but we have no testing centers. So it was the Black church that gave the clarion call and said, hey, something's wrong. As a result of the Black church doing that, we started seeing 1 or 2 testing centers, but then Black folk weren't responding, even with the testing centers. There were 2 things going on at the same time. And Dr. Bridget really alluded to it, access. Access. We couldn't get to the hospitals because of lack of transportation, because it was too difficult, because of a whole lot of things. The guidelines that they set made no sense to us. It did not, the guidelines did not contribute to our safety and health and welfare. So that was one issue. Within our community, we've got, in St. Louis, we've got 3 primary federally qualified healthcare centers. We've got Care STL, we got Peoples, and we got Affinia. Peoples didn't have the capacity originally to do it. Care STL did, and it's in the hood. Affinia did, but it primarily serves in the county. So then you've got the 3 of them trying to position themselves almost in a competitive way to see who's going to get the resources in order to serve our community. You've got all of this going on, Dr. Gould. We had to make sure that our folk got masks. So the churches petitioned the governor, petitioned the county executive, petitioned the mayor, because we needed to give our people masks, because our people couldn't get to where the masks were being distributed. So we had to find a way to do it. So we did it through the churches, not just for church people, but for the communities surrounding the church. We call them the host communities. And then finally, within the Black church, we had to deal with it's taboo. Some churches not wanting to close their churches, not because God is able, but because finances will decrease. And then a lot of our folk, if we're talking about virtual, grandmama don't know nothing about no computer, and grandmama's the one keeping the church up. So you've got to deal with older pastors who want to continue to bring people to church and give them the virus, versus trying to teach an old dog new tricks, to try to get to the point where you identify somebody in your congregation that knows how to do Zoom, who's Zooming who, that knows how to do Zoom and all the conference calls, but become more technologically savvy. All of these things were happening in the Black community all at once. In addition to what you said, Dr. Gould, we're still burying people at the same time. And the coronavirus wasn't the only pandemic that we were dealing with. So I'm Baptist. I give long answers to short questions.
All good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. So you touched on a couple of things, Reverend Gray. You talked about this collaboration that had to happen with cities and care services. Reverend Bridget also talked about that, having to then go to the county and etc. We have the authority, right? As faith leaders, we have an authority and a responsibility. Unlike, honestly, our ancestors who had to wait for someone to tell them that they were free. And we're all Christian pastors in this space. We have to believe what the word said, that whom the Son sets free is free indeed. And so part of how I am imagining that we really start to move as we come out of at least this one pandemic is that we have to use our authority. Reverend Gray is right. Even when we learned this in Ferguson, through the Black Lives Movement of last year and in ongoing spaces that we've been in, the Stockley verdict and et cetera, even those who we've made it so uncomfortable and not welcome them into our church space, they still know that we have influence. They still know that we have a role and responsibility, and they're waiting on us. They're waiting on us to get our act together. They're waiting on us to not be zoomed by elected officials and by policies and politicians so that we might deliver the services to the people. See, if little man calls the governor's certainly not going to respond. And so we have an opportunity and an obligation to actually use that alleged influence that we have and make sure that the people are getting what they need when they need it. The pandemic is still going on. I'm grateful that there are churches in mid-Missouri, across Missouri, having vaccination clinics. The Joshua House here in Jefferson City has had multiple clinics. By now, we'll probably have additional ones. Missouri Faith Voices, we're still looking for ambassadors. If you know a young person, particularly under 35, that was hesitant to get a vaccine, let us know so that we might have and got it, was hesitant and then got it. We can pay them a stipend to be an ambassador, to be a trusted messenger, to go and share with other people that they are connected to that might not be coming in our Zoom rooms or into our buildings, so that we might help to continue to keep our people safe and to protect our people from at least this one pandemic. Reverend Gray, last year, it wasn't just the pandemic that was caused by the novel coronavirus. It was Ahmaud Arbery. It was Breonna Taylor, who still has, family hasn't gotten even a glimpse of redemption of any kind. It was George Floyd particularly that stopped us in our tracks, similar to watching our beloved Mike Brown body on that ground in that hot August day 7 years ago, seeing the knee on the neck of George Floyd disrupted even the pandemic and called some to the streets. You ran to the streets, as you always do. Let's shift a little bit and talk about this pandemic of policing that has plagued our community since 1619. Let's talk about why policing is an issue and what is the role of church. I know that we tried to stay in our place. We've been zoomed by the separation of church and state. We've been zoomed by politicians. We've been zoomed by relationships with law enforcement. We were in a meeting earlier this week and we named that many of us have law enforcement officers in our pews. Right. Some of us serve on commissions and etc. But we're in a particular state with policing in America. A week ago, we got the vehicular stops report. While there had been some drop because of the pandemic and less people were driving, there is still a problem in Missouri, in America, with how blue interacts with Black, even when Black wears blue. So why was it important to you, Reverend Gray, to take to the streets once again, to gather and galvanize Expect Us and others to go to the streets in St. Louis last year in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd?
You know, civil disobedience isn't something, and you know it, Dr. Gould, to be taken lightly at all. It's never the first resort. It can't be. It can never ever be seen as simply a knee-jerk reaction. It has to be deliberate. It has to be intentional. Because when you do it, you do realize oftentimes that those of us in the street are putting our health and safety and even at times our lives on the line, on that front line. And so we understood when George Floyd was killed, that 9 minutes and 29 seconds, how insidious it was, how vicious and how evil it was. And when you think about, when we looked at this police officer who has sworn to protect and serve, who has been given the authority with the badge and the gun to kill at his own discretion. And we saw that that in this particular case, this person looks in the camera for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He looks in the camera as if to defy everything that is pure, holy, righteous, good. And he seems to say with his expression, I've done this before. Or I know somebody who has done this before. We are above the law. We have qualified immunity. We have the police officer's Bill of Rights. The bar is set so high for you to judge me, for you to prosecute me, that I can do this and get away with it. And that's what many of us heard. Even through the silence, we heard George Floyd's cry. We heard him calling out for his mother. Many of us heard him take his last breath. And Black folk, I believe at that moment, we saw the Breonna Taylor, we saw the Sandra Bland, we saw the Eric Gardner, we saw all of this, but I think it was just because Mike Brown was a very poignant moment too. Very poignant moment. And I think Mike Brown's case was because how they treated him so much like an animal, keeping him in that smoldering heat for so long with his mother watching. I think that's what moved us. But with George Floyd, it was all of those things that caused us, Dr. Gould, to say that it put in mind the noose and the whip and the branding iron and the billy club and the water hose and the dogs. All of this was combined in that moment. And we felt, the world felt that we had to respond. The Bible is clear. He has shown you, O person, man or woman, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly. That's God's word. And so so that moving to the front line, for those of us who believe in God's word and who believe in that moving and organizing and protesting and demonstration was not optional. It just wasn't. It wasn't, and I get emotional about this because I know how dangerous it is. And I get emotional too because expect us is a lot of young people. Congresswoman Cori Bush, State Representative Rasheed Aldridge, Ferguson City Councilwoman Fran Griffin, Francesca Green, I keep calling her Griffin, Ohan Ash, people who have been targeted. People who have been targeted by police, arrested multiple times because they are protest leaders. But very few pastors, very few clergy leaders. Now, of course, Reverend Gould, you were there. People like David Girth was there. John Stratton was there. Teresa Danley. More white clergy than Black clergy. Brother Stencil was there. His wife, Lord Jesus, forgive me.
I know.
Because if the church is not going to be the headlight for social change and social justice, then we regulate ourselves to be in the tail light. And that is why I think I accepted the mantle and assumed some responsibility, not necessarily leadership, because I worked in cooperation and in conjunction. I worked collectively with activists and protesters. But I thought that it was important for, at least as a Black pastor, that then the Black church would be represented. Even though it may not have been a lot of us, when people saw Reverend Gray and Dr. Gould, and Reverend Stencil and Minister Christine, then at least they see Black preachers, therefore the Black church is represented. And it was important at that time, with everybody responding to the death of George Floyd, that the Black church responded to.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm with you. I get emotional, right? You touched on a couple things as we frame this question for Reverend Bridget. And you said, what drew us to the streets 7 years ago in Ferguson? Reality was the young people called us on the carpet. Reality was the young people were having church in the streets while we were held up with our respectable Black selves inside church buildings, trying to keep everything in the building respectable. Same thing last year. I was on countless panels across the country, and folk were trying to analyze the Black Lives Matter movement. And I posed the question to some folk, and I said to them, what if Black Lives Matter was the church? I don't think that the question is about Black Lives Matter and the church. Could be time for us to examine our theology, to dismantle the barriers that have been erupted to ensure that only certain folk get to carry the news. What I have experienced in the streets is when I listen to the hymnology, listen to the hymns of the streets, hands up, don't shoot. Listen to the various calls in the street. This is what democracy looks like. I've learned that that was as much church and even more church than being in a building deciding that not all of God's children were able to come in. Policing is an issue, not just where CNN shows up. Policing is an issue in Jefferson City. It's an issue in Boonville, Columbia, St. Louis, and in anywhere America. Reverend Mitchell, because we don't want to just be those who call out the obvious, right? How do you think the church can help lead the community in reimagining policing? And what do you believe that we can learn from the theology of Black Lives Matter?
Okay, so I'm gonna switch it, and I'm gonna.
That's all good.
Okay, Black Lives Matter. I read an article a couple of weeks ago, and why the church seems to be no longer relevant, especially along the Black Lives Matter movement. Our acceptance level of anybody different from us is just, it sucks. If I could just be honest, it just sucks. And Black Lives Matter movement has provided a space for all people to be included. That includes those from the LGBTQIA plus, I hope I got that right, y'all, community, people of color. Because in our churches, we have set up and we have said, you can come in, but you can't come in. Like you said, we sit up in there with all of our little respectability and things like that, and we've told people that, okay, don't ask, don't tell, or you can play the organ and this and that and the other. And as far as I looked at Matthew 25 tells us that, you know, if whatever you've done to the least of these, you've also done to me. Our theology is all messed up. And so these kids are not trying to hear that no more about, you know, this and that and the other, the things that we clothe ourselves in respectability about, especially preachers and people in the pews who say God is love, but then you turn around and you don't show love, or you're busy. I don't know. Our prejudice level, and it always makes me think about this especially in my mind, how can we as an oppressed people turn around and oppress other people that's different from us? And so where we get hung up at is that as we're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and churches, we've got more churches that want to sit over here and say, I'm not going to bother what's going on because that's going to affect my bottom line, instead of educating their congregants about why God is love, why it's okay to love your neighbor. As Methodists, we know this. We say this every Sunday. You know, you love God as you love God first, and then you love your neighbor as you love yourself. But how can you love your neighbor who might be gay, who might be trans, who might be bi, and you all the time talking crazy about them or pushing them away, but you say you love God? That's a whole different theological thing right there that I love to go into, you know. And so we've made God this inaccessible being to other people, just like white America has made white Jesus inaccessible to Black Americans. Funniest thing to me is when Florida Evans refused to get rid of white Jesus, when Michael Evans painted the Black Jesus, even though he looked like Ned the Wino. See, we're so indoctrinated about what we think is right. And a lot of times we've got it wrong. So let me tie that into policing. The first thing I did with the George Floyd murder, that's what it was a murder, was I went to the police station after we had our protest. We marched and we protested, and I wanted to speak to the police chief. Things that I didn't know, I found out. Like there's no national registry for police officers who might have gotten fired out of one department. And I'm like, okay, but y'all want to check my credit when I go apply for a job, but you don't check the background and why this person got in trouble at this police department, but you can hire him here. So we have a problem, first of all, with policy. There's no national database in which to check the backgrounds and some of these disciplinary actions against some of these law enforcement officers who just take the same behaviors from one police department to another. I was shocked when we got a guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin. I really was, because really what I expected was that little girl down in Texas that shot that Black man and the judge hugged her. I'm sorry. You know, and so now I hear in some of the other reports that she's looking for her sentence to be reduced because she doesn't think she got a fair. You got a hug from the judge. Most of us don't get no hug from the judge. Understand? Most of us, I've been down for plenty of speeding tickets in Kansas City, and all they tell me is you better hire a lawyer unless you're going to go to jail for 30 days. So I do. But policing also means asking the hard questions, having these meetings with the police department, making sure that you show up. My job has been to show up to these meetings. I've got one person out of our congregation that's on the police, whatever board it is. And I ask her all the time, do I need to show up? Do I need to holler as loud as I need to holler about these policy changes and this and that and the other? And also, as the Black church, since Black people have a distrust of police officers, period, anyway, Black or white, because some of my worst experience have been by officers who's this color. You know, I can smile as pretty as I want to. I can flash these big old brown eyes. They ain't having it. And so we have a problem with the culture of the police department, not the race per se. Yes, we do have a problem with that, but we have a problem with the whole culture of the police departments. This blue wall of silence, this fraternity, this unhealthy organism that tells police officers that nobody's life is worth nothing. And so what I think we need to do is more community involvement, especially Black churches, to say, hey, when you take one of mine down, I'm expecting you to treat them with all the rights and privileges that is granted to them in that Constitution. They are innocent before proven guilty. They have right to representation. I ask everybody to get arrested. Did they read you your rights? Because if they didn't, then you can go get you a lawyer and say, drop this case. I want to make sure, as their pastor, to say, are they being treated well? I want to see them. So I tell everybody in my own congregation, if you go to jail, please be sure to put me down so I can come down and see you. So I can make sure I'm allowed access to you as far as your record and things of that nature, and let me help you stay alive. We have to show up. We have done a horrible job about showing up for our own people. We just have. We hear Junior down the street done got arrested. Oh, that's just Junior. But how do you know Junior's being treated well while he's in jail, away in trial? We have to show up, and we have to keep showing up, and we have to ask the police departments these really hard questions that nobody likes to ask. I didn't know some of the things until I started asking and showing up and saying, my eye is on you. This is your policy. This is what you say your policy is. I'm looking at the policy. You didn't do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Reverend Bridget. Showing up is a part of our responsibility. Changing the conversation, right? Certainly we want our children to get home alive, but most often than not, we focus on putting the responsibility on the victims. And it is not enough. You can comply and still die.
That's right.
So we have a role and responsibility. Missouri Faith Voices will be convening in the near future a webinar specifically on policing and what we can do and how we might understand policing in our own particular communities and how we might use our influence to enact change in those spaces. I wish we had more time, but we don't. We're going to wrap with talking about politics, the intersection. You know, it's interesting that we are taught that you don't talk about faith and you don't talk about politics. And if you know me, you know that my role is to disrupt most of those things that don't make sense. And so those are my two favorite things. My work is at the intersection of faith and politics. And so we are living in a particularly interesting situation, a season in America and in Missouri. It is only by the grace of God that we are still here after 4 years of all that we were subjected to from the last administration. But here we are using the words found in the book of Esther. Maybe, just maybe, God has called us for such a time as this. Now, our responsibility is to make sure that we act accordingly. You mentioned Matthew 25. Jesus asked the various questions: when I was hungry, when I was sick, when I was ill. If Jesus were to ask the administration, the governor, the legislative body in the state of Missouri who occupy the Capitol on our dime, when I was sick, what did you do for me? They would have to respond, we cut your Medicaid expansion. We took your health care away. When we think about politics, when we think about the state of play around voting right restrictions, which is near and dear to all of our hearts, thinking about what it means to have a voice, thinking about everything that came out of not just the civil rights movement, but all the way back to after the Civil War. The reason, the impetus for Juneteenth. What do you believe as a church we should be engaging in? How should we be confronting these politicians and these policies? You talked about the underlying conditions in COVID. It's not just that you eat too much chicken. It's not just that you're always in the McDonald's drive-thru. It's that McDonald's is closer to you than a grocery store. It's that the chicken shacks or in your neighborhood and not in other folk neighborhoods. And so how should we be responding to politicians in Missouri right now, Reverend Gray? We will be coming up on a special session in July. What should clergy be poised to do?
I think, Dr. Gould, that we need to position ourselves based upon this passage of scripture. Luke 4:18 and 19. This should be our call. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. That has got to be our rallying cry. That has got to be what moves the Black church to engage in public policy and to help guide political discourse. It is in the area of public policy, it is in the area of political discourse that decisions are made as to how resources will be allocated and what groups are deserving of those resources. And so in saying that, I think that if we use the passage of scripture that Jesus used to begin his ministry, if we use that passage of scripture, because most churches will push back against social justice and getting involved and being engaged. But if we remind them of the words of Christ, then I think we're going to get more churches engaged in this whole, in public policy and public discourse, political discourse, because it is our mission to speak truth to power. And so when we see a state government taking away our right to vote through egregious voter suppression laws that have nothing to do with anything except to maintain political power, then we have to say that. But in addition, Dr. Gould, to making that proclamation that this is wrong, as my grandmother would say, God rest her soul, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Then at the same time, we have to make sure that as the watch people, we have to say, okay, let's do more voter registration. Let's check everybody's registration in our congregation to make sure that it is still current. That because you move, you used to live in grandmama's house, now you are shacking with somebody, so you got a new address. So let's go ahead and check out that address. Or did you vote in the last 2 elections? Because you could be purged. So let's make sure that as we say to the oppressor that you have your political foot on our neck, that we're also saying to people who are feeling the pressure of the political knee on the neck, there's a way that you can get out of this. So we have to do both. It's not an either or, Dr. Gould, as to what the church ought to be doing. It's the all of the above. And so we have to be more vocal in speaking out against oppression and injustice. We have to, as a church, as Dr. Bridget has said, we need to work to form alliances. When you talk about Black Lives Matter and some of these conservative pastors, Dr. Bridget talked specifically about why some of those pastors backed off. LGBTQA plus all the alphabets. Although they weren't acknowledging that 20%, 30% of their congregation are members of the LGBTQA community, but they're not acknowledging that. Dr. King said we have to build alliances based upon necessity and not necessarily desirability. I don't have to agree with your lifestyle. One thing I will say that they'll come at me for this reason today, they're going to come at you for that reason tomorrow. And because we know that the oppressor is the same oppressor, LGBTQ oppressor is the same oppressor as a Black woman oppressor, a Black man oppressor, whatever. Oppression is oppression. And Dr. Bridget, thank you for saying it. We have to be careful in the Black church that we do not become what we once despised. And so I think that in doing that, I wish I could say, Dr. Gould, I wish I could pinpoint one particular item that's more egregious or than others. But the reality in Missouri or Missouri, depending upon where you are, we have a plethora of issues that affect Black folk, people of color, marginalized people. And we don't have the luxury, unfortunately, of trying to identify one at a time. We've got to identify all of them. And then we've got to work together to say, Dr. Bridget, you got this one. Dr. Gould, you got this one. Reverend Gray, you got this one. And then at the end of the day, when we are exhausted, come back to the kitchen table, be replenished, be renourished, plan our strategy for the next day. That's what we've got to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Gray. Reverend Mitchell, your last question. Some churches are already back. Some are preparing to go back. As we prepare, most people have just been talking about, do we stay on Zoom or do we get off from Zoom? It's bigger than that. How do you believe that in this moment, we can also, as Dr. Reverend Gray said, focus on more than one thing? Focus not just on what's going to happen in our building or in Zoom. What do you believe God is calling us to do in this moment as other authorities, other principalities try and decide what will happen to our people on our tax dollar in the capital of Missouri?
I believe God is saying that, I used to hear in the beginning of the pandemic, I just want to get back to normal. I just want to get back, but normal wasn't working. It wasn't working. We weren't getting people in the pews. Matter of fact, we're bleeding out members, truth be told. And I think that's every denomination. I'm just not going to pick on ours, but we're bleeding people out of the pews. There's just nobody there to replace them. Normal wasn't working. And so we have to rethink what, I don't even want to call it the new normal. I tell them I don't want to say that because, see, when you normalize something, you start to get used to something. And you don't want to get used to something and then get mad because you have to change it later. There is a time now for the church to be the universal church. And if that means doing hybrid services in correlation with Zoom, Facebook Live, if you have even better equipment than that, you can get your own cable station, along with those who have been, vaccinated, and you can comfortably fit people with the social distancing and still the masking. It's time to do something different, because we've done, I'm going to put it in Methodism terms, especially African Methodism. I pastored a church once, and they had 4 members. This great big old building. Couldn't pay the insurance, couldn't pay the gas bill, and yet and still, when it came time to finally decide whether to close the building, they said, but my mama now did this, and we want to keep this legacy. I thought that was a beautiful thought. But when you cannot pay your bills and you have no way of getting new members into your church, it's time to close. Sometimes we have to wake up and just understand when it's time to give up the ghost and say, okay, this process has run its course. Let's think of a new process. And I think that's what's been so special about St. Matthew's. We didn't want to think about a new process, but we had to. And so those pastors who are still insisting on going in because of their financial, I ain't had no financial problem. And that's not because we didn't open, we did whatever we did, is because we had to look at a new process. That means putting giving online for those who are tech savvy. Sometimes that meant me going to go pick up your offering out of the envelope, out of the mailbox, or whatever, and also staying in constant communication. This is where I knew about Zoom, but I learned about call trees. I learned about group text that nobody likes. I learned about so much in technology in order to stay in contact with the people and make sure that the people stayed in contact with each other. We still did ministry. There's a way to do ministry. When everybody was hoarding paper towels and toilet paper, I told everybody at the beginning of the pandemic, if you go out to and you go buy toilet paper for your house, buy 2 more, because we're going to put it over here at the church, and whoever you hear of in the community that has a need, then we can go over there and put a sack together and make sure that they have toilet paper and paper towels and hand sanitizers and stuff like that. And so there's still a way to do ministry without having to be in the 4 walls. Sure, we love our buildings. Our buildings are, some of them or most of them are pretty beautiful, and ours been here for 155 years on this same corner. However, the ministry just does not stop on this corner. That ministry expands out to the community. And so right now, I'm looking for the church to become truly the universal church that does not stop because you couldn't think of a different way to do something.
And if we're going to be the universal church, we're going to have to speak not just for, let me take that back. We're going to speak with, give access to those who have not been given the microphone. When we go to the mayor's shindig, take those in the community who weren't invited with us, send them instead of going ourselves. We're going to have to continue to speak truth to power. We're going to have to do everything that we can in order for our communities to truly be liberated, so that we will not continue to be zoomed by powers to be under the guise of separation of church and state. Nelson Mandela said, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." The church was called in the beginning. The church is called now. The church was called when our ancestors in Missouri and Texas got the news of liberation. And the church is called now when politicians are sitting right now trying to imagine how they can keep a proverbial knee on our neck. The church is called to reimagine and to bring the good news. To be free is to ensure that we are liberating others. Thank you for listening, for being with us today. You can expect us in the streets of St. Louis, in the streets of the Capitol. You can expect that Reverend Mitchell will be leading protests and speaking truth to power in mid-Missouri. You can expect that Missouri Faith Voices in Jefferson City, Columbia, and a lot of places in between St. Louis, Springfield, and Kansas City will do our part to keep the pain of the people in the public square, in the minds of faith leaders, and to equip people to speak truth to power from under the dome to the corner that is next to your church. Who's zooming who? Politics, pandemics, and policing. A lot more that we can talk about, but we'll end now. And we want to thank Reverend W.2 Edmondson, Sister Gwen Edmondson, and all of those who make up the Juneteenth committee in Jefferson City, Missouri, for continuing to bring relevant information and relevant opportunities, even virtually, to us, not just in mid-Missouri, but from across the state. I'm Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould. I currently serve as the Executive Director of Missouri Faith Voices. I'm the pastor in the public square. Wherever there's a need for the people, you will find me lifting my voice beyond the walls. Until next time, blessings.